Hi, I'm Vaughn Tan, author of The Uncertainty Mindset, Innovation Insights from the Frontiers of Food. And today I want to tell you about when and how uncertainty can be good for your business, why uncertainty feeds innovation. So we instinctively avoid uncertainty because not knowing never seems like it's going to be that much fun. But not knowing is the only way people and businesses can learn and change. So the argument I'm going to make is that you should cultivate uncertainty, but productive uncertainty, because productive uncertainty helps your business do new things and become more resilient and successful. So today I want to say three sets of things. The first is I want to open up the idea of what food and beverage innovation could be. Then I want to explain why uncertainty feeds innovation. And then I want to close by offering a few suggestions about how to be productively uncertain. I'm an author, consultant, and strategy professor at University College London School of Management. The work I do is to design teams and businesses to be more innovative so they can flourish in uncertain times, like the ones that we face today. I spent over a decade focusing on innovation and strategy for the food and beverage industry, and I've looked at some of the most interesting and innovative R&D teams in the world, like Jose Andres' Think Food Group and his R&D team, the Think Food Tank, the Cooking Lab, which is the producer of Modernist Cuisine and other books that you know about, and the Fat Duck, which has been one of the leaders in culinary innovation for many years now. Many of the insights that I'm going to share with you today came out of that research, and I've put them into a book that I came out with last year called The Uncertainty Mindset, which I'll tell you a little bit more about at the end of this talk. So first, what is food and beverage innovation? Innovation is just coming up with something new that people want to buy for more than it costs you to make. In the coffee business, a lot of you will be familiar with the idea of product innovation. So what you see on the screen now is a few photographs from the many false steps, wrong paths that Pete Williams went down when he was coaching Hugh Kelly for the Australian Barista Championships in 2019. What he was doing with Hugh was trying to develop a new signature drink that would illustrate how environmental changes affect how fruit ferments. Right, so the final product was an espresso drink with a plum and rose extract, but to get to the point where you have this new product, they went through many stages of development and learning. Now, this kind of product innovation, I think, like I said, many of you are probably very familiar with, but innovation can happen in many other places and in many other ways, and I want to talk about some of those today. So apart from product innovation, there's all these other kinds of things that you can innovate in, and I think they're actually really quite important. So let's talk about service innovation. In the coffee business, service innovation is something that I'm sure many of you think about all the time. What I'm saying is to think about it in the context of a business and thinking about how you might redesign your business around it. So if you're at a time when ambitious coffee is only espresso drinks, it might be a form of service innovation to think about how you could configure a coffee shop or a coffee bar around only manual methods. And that's what Square Mile did with its Penny University project in London, a tiny 6-seat bar designed to experiment with and highlight manual methods at a time when really nobody else was doing that. Now, other than product and service innovation, you can also think about process innovation. Now, process innovation is particularly interesting because it often is very good for the business, even though the end consumer doesn't realize it's happening. I'll give you an example. What you see on screen is basically in the basement of one of Jose Andres' Think Food Group restaurants. And this restaurant happens to serve, among other things, cannellonis. So these are handmade filled pasta tubes that you make by laying out pasta sheets one by one and spooning in the filling and then rolling them up. Now, the problem with that way of making cannellonis is that it takes up too much prep space to make. And as you know, in restaurants, there's just not that much room anyway. And because of that, it took too long. It was also inconsistent because all the cannellonis that were produced were all slightly different. And because it took too long, there was also a high failure rate. Like the pasta skins would dry out, they would crack, and there was a lot of wastage from this recipe. So Jose's R&D team, the Think Food Tank, they took a look at this problem and they didn't change the recipe at all. All they did was they changed the process by which the cannellonis were assembled. So what you see in these three photographs is the result of their process innovation process. Eventually, they figured out that you could lay out the pasta sheets to overlap them. And in doing this, so instead of laying them out separately, you overlap them. And by doing this, you can, I don't know, like quadruple or more the number of sheets that will fit in the same space. And then fill them with a piping bag instead of a spoon for consistency. And if you do it the right way, if you lay out the pasta sheets in the right order, what you can do is you can then roll up the filled cannellonis into their final holding position so that you don't even have to move them more than once. And by doing this, changing this process, even if they didn't change the recipe, the Think Food tank managed to reduce the prep space needed for cannellonis by something like 10x. It cut into a quarter the amount of time taken to produce the same number of cannellonis, and there was an almost 0% failure rate. So there was almost no wastage coming out of this new process. Now, obviously this affected the bottom line, right? It was good for the bottom line. It made this product much more profitable. But one really important thing that almost all process innovations do, which is why they're so important, is that in this case, it made the prep cook much happier and much less stressed, right? His job, which used to be kind of a pain, now became faster and also more satisfying. Like, he does these cannellonis and they don't fail. I think process innovation is barely ever seen by the end consumer, but it's even more important because it's so unsexy, right? It is so valuable for the business that it's worth doing, even if the consumer doesn't necessarily know that you're doing it. Now, beyond product, service, and process innovation, you can also think about innovating at the level of the business model. So Jack Benchicle runs one of my favorite coffee shops in LA. It's called Endorphin. And before he went into coffee, he was a biochemist and a pastry chef. And his business model, you might not know this just by looking at the coffee bar, actually has 3 parts, and they feed off of each other. So there's a small scale coffee bar to have close interactions with customers. And then he's also got a dessert pop-up called 9. And he doesn't do this all the time. He does it actually quite infrequently. But every time he does it, it's an opportunity to experiment with flavors and flavor pairings because he's making new desserts that have different flavor combinations, and he's making new drinks that have different flavor combinations that are not always about coffee, and he's pairing them together. Now, where it all gets really interesting is that he also has the third part of his business model is a ready-to-drink product, a canned drink product, that draws on his customer insights from Endorphin, the coffee bar, and on the flavor pairing insights that he has from 9, the dessert pop-up, and integrates them in this ready-to-drink product that itself is the only part of this 3-part business model that could achieve real scale, right? So he's got this 3-part business model where the 3 parts work individually, but they actually work synergistically with each other. And that way of thinking about a business model, I think, is really innovative. Now, beyond just a business model innovation, you can also think about how you can innovate in terms of how your organization itself is structured. So I'm on the board of Rethink Food in New York, and Rethink is a not-for-profit that works to reduce food waste while making food more accessible to people who need it. When it started out several years ago, it was organized basically as a commissary kitchen where it would take in diverted product that would otherwise have gone to waste from its partner organizations, and it would produce safe food and distribute it itself. Since then, in the last few years, it's realized that that commissary model doesn't scale. It could serve a lot of food, but it couldn't really serve as much food as Rethink thinks needs to be served in order to solve the food waste problem and also the food accessibility problem. So it decided to reorganize how it thinks about how it organizes. So since then, it has developed a different organizational model where what it does, instead of making its own food, is it trains and certifies partners to source, produce, and serve food in ways that reduce food waste in production, use up diverted food waste, and also makes food access more equitable. Again, by reorganizing and innovating in terms of how it thinks about the organization, Rethink is now able to consider scaling up to a level that it would never have been able to do if it was doing all of it itself. Now, business model and organizational innovation, I think, are really important. But the most interesting thing actually really for the coffee business may be this idea that you can innovate by coming up with a new and unique idea of what quality even means. And I'll give you an example from the Fat Duck, which I worked with when they were closing down their restaurant in Bray to renovate it. And what they did when they had that year-long close was they decided they wanted to rethink what it meant to have a really, really good meal at the Fat Duck. And what they came up with was this idea that having a really good meal is not just having incredibly delicious individual plates of food, but actually the idea that you could have a story that was being told to the guest across the entire arc of the meal, told through individual dishes and connected across those dishes. And in fact, starting not just when they enter the restaurant, but from the time they make the reservation through to the time they leave and go home. And not just that there is an arc of the story across this entire meal, but also that every story that is told to every guest should be personalized to that guest. Now, that idea of what quality means for a meal is new, right? Many restaurants have tried to tell stories in individual dishes before, but no one's tried to tell a story across the entire arc of a meal that is so personalized to the individual. None of these kinds of innovation that I've talked about are easy. And they all require lots of trade-off. They're expensive in time and effort to do. They're risky. They don't always succeed. But if you do succeed, what you get is you get more loyal customers, happier employees, and this is really important, more satisfied owners. And that maybe is worth all these trade-offs. So if you decide that you want to pursue many of these kinds of innovation in your business, what do you do? Now, this is where this point I'm trying to make about uncertainty feeding innovation comes in. Innovation means doing something new. And doing something new, by definition, means doing something you don't know how to do yet and might never figure out. By definition, if you want to innovate, you have to be in a position where you don't know something. So you and your business can only innovate if you seek out uncertainty. Now, uncertainty can be a tool for learning and growth, for sure. But in order for it to be a tool for learning and growth, it has to be designed to be productive. And so I want to give you a few suggestions for how to design the uncertainty that you put yourself into so that it helps you learn and grow. So I want to propose 3 concrete ways that you can generate productive uncertainty in your business. The first one is to experiment. Do things you're unsure about or don't know how to do yet to see whether or not you can figure it out. So many of you know about this set of books, Modernist Cuisine, which brings together a lot of the science relevant to cooking and puts it all in one place in a way that is easy to understand. The thing that maybe you don't know about is that this began as an experiment in figuring out something that Nathan Myhrvold, who is the founder of the Cooking Lab and used to be the CTO at Microsoft, he didn't know how sous vide worked. And so in the course of trying to experiment with sous vide to learn how it worked, he realized to understand sous vide required you to understand a lot of cooking science. And eventually he realized it was so much science that it wasn't just a project for one person to work on that would fit in one small book. It was a project for a whole team that would fit in a 5-volume book. Now, that whole sequence of experiments that took many years eventually resulted not just in Modernist Cuisine, but also in a whole series of other books in which they don't know something, try and figure it out, and learn stuff along the way that they then present as books, right? So they've done Modernist Bread. They've thought a lot about how to photograph and illustrate scientific principles so that they're easy to understand. You've got the photography of Modernist Cuisine, and now they're working on Modernist Pizza. Now, the second thing you can do to be productively uncertain is to design for learning. I've said already that you need to experiment to innovate, but the important thing with designing experiments is you should design them so that they benefit you even if they don't go as planned. And this maybe sounds very obvious, but most of the time what we do as humans is if we do something and it doesn't work, we think, oh, that's a failure. Now, the key with designing experiments so that they benefit you even if they don't work is that even if they don't work, you still learn something. And if you design them right, you can learn something which is valuable even if the intended outcome wasn't achieved. So what you see on screen is from Noma, a restaurant in Copenhagen in Denmark. And on the left, you see an experiment that they ran many years ago when they were trying to make a fish sauce out of waste mackerel byproduct from the restaurant. The first few experiments in fish sauce that they tried just didn't work. The product was not very tasty. But even though those experiments technically failed, what the Noma R&D team was doing was learning from those experiments about how to do fermentation, specifically about fish sauce, and being able to apply those learnings to other kinds of things they were trying to ferment. So now, many years later, Noma knows a lot more about fermentation because they've been learning from their multiple failures over the years. And Noma now uses fermented products throughout their entire menu. And in fact, they learn so much about fermentation that they were able to put it together into a book, right? The Noma Guide to Fermentation, which came out possibly last year or the year before that. It's a great book, and it only exists because they failed a lot and they learned from all those failed experiments along the way. Now, the third concrete thing you can do to be productively uncertain is to load progressively. If you go to the gym for the first time in years, or maybe for the first time ever, you don't immediately start bench pressing like 350 kilograms. What you do is you start small, and then as you work up, you push a little bit further and a little bit further and a little bit further still. Now, what you see on screen is the very first MAD Symposium's speakers. And back then in 2011, it was just a thought from the team at Noma that they should have a conference where chefs who are trying to think about new ways of doing things could ask questions that you could not normally ask at a chef conference. Since that first MAD, the MAD team has spun off into its own organization. It's developed new kinds of conference programming. And now, in the last year and a half, they've done their biggest experiment yet, which is to go from being a conference to being a school for the food and hospitality industry to learn new ways of thinking about what food innovation could be. Now, if you want to feed innovation in your organization, I think you need to think broadly. And I just want to kind of wrap by saying, innovation isn't just new products. It's much easier to innovate when you have a broader idea of what innovation could be. And it could also be new services, new processes, new business models, new organizational structures, and I think this is important, new ideas of what quality is or could be. And if you do one or more of these kinds of innovation, chances are high that you will get more loyal customers, happier employees, and more satisfied owners. So just to wrap up, if you want to innovate, you cannot avoid not knowing and uncertainty. In fact, you have to seek it out. But you should design this uncertainty that you put yourself into so that it's productive. And the way to do that is to experiment often, design the experiments for learning, and load the experiments progressively. Now, a lot of the ideas that I talked about today and more are in my book, The Uncertainty Mindset, Innovation Insights from the Frontiers of Food, which is a travelogue through some of the world's most interesting culinary R&D teams to extract some of the ideas about how they organize themselves to be really good at innovating and being resilient. You can find out more about that at uncertaintymindset.org. I'm also building some tools for people like you to learn how to be more comfortable with being productively uncomfortable, with being productively uncertain. You can find out more about that at productivediscomfort.org. And of course, you can find out more about the other things I'm working on at vaughntan.org, on Instagram at vaughn.tan, and on Twitter at vaughn_tan. Thanks very much.